Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basic. I knew this chief, who was a fine, intelligent, and shrewd man. He often came over to San Francisco to purchase goods from Nathan Spear, whose agent I then was. He owned 600 cattle, numerous horses and sheep, and was quite a noted breeder. He was punctual in meeting his obligations, and, owing to this and to his affability and intelligence, was highly esteemed by us all. He could read and write and keep accounts, having been educated by the old missionaries. Camilo was the grantee of a rancho of about 2 leagues of land known as Olompali, bordering on the Bay of San Francisco. Now that is a quote from a man named William Heath Davis, who wrote a book titled 75 Years in California, Recollections and Remarks by One Who Visited These Shores in 1831 and again in 1833, and except when absent on business, was a resident from 1838 until the end of a long life in 1909. And there he is talking about a rancho owner named Camilo Enitia, a Coast Miwok leader, who is one of a few native people who owned ranchos in Alta, California. Today I'm going to talk about a subject that to me is fascinating, and I think it is not very well known in the history of California, and that's the subject of Native American ranchos. And in particular, I'm going to talk about northern Alta, California, prior to U.S. annexation. So in order to do that, we're going to cover a few topics, one of which is land law in Spanish California, land grants and ranchos in Spanish and Mexican California, then Native American vaqueros and ranchos and some examples of those, and then the aftermath of this era and some conclusions. So let's begin. What is a rancho? Now, I have a recording about ranchos, which you can go back and listen to, which gives an overview. But here I'm just going to recap a little bit about what a rancho is. And obviously the word ranch in English comes from this Spanish word rancho. And rancho has had many meanings throughout the years. But most of those meanings, if you go and look at the dictionary of the Spanish Royal Academy, but if you go to older dictionaries that talk about how the words were used in centuries past, you see that the word rancho most often refers to a place where people gather. Now, during the Spanish colonial period in the Americas, it really became associated with a place for raising cattle and other livestock. This is still its meaning today throughout much of Latin America. And in Spanish and Mexican California, rancho mainly meant a cattle farm. During the Spanish period, there were a small number of private ranchos that didn't belong to the king, to the government, but the rancho era in California really started under Mexican rule. Now, the idea of a rancho in Spanish and Mexican California, of course, it has a legal aspect, right? And land law in Spanish California traces its origins back to King Alfonso X of Castile, who compiled a very famous medieval law book known as the Seven Chapters, or Siete Partidas in Spanish. And those laws kind of codified the relationships between the king, different classes of people, land use, crime, inheritance, etc. And it was really based on Roman law and then the medieval traditions of Spain. Now later, and we're talking about the Americas, you have another legal corpus, a body of laws which evolves out of Spanish law in Spain, but it's applied directly to the Americas, and it's called the Laws of the Indies. And it enumerated the rights of indigenous people, Spaniards in the Americas, and people of mixed origin, mestizos. And the main goal of this law, of this series of laws, was the elimination of what was known as the encomienda system, which was the system of tribute that Native people had to give, which was denounced by many people, including the famous Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who said that it was the encomienda system, the system of tribute, was de facto slavery and that it was unjust. So the creation of this body of laws known as the Law of Indies provoked a lot of conflict in Latin America in the time that it came out in the 17th century. And it did certain things like establishing distances between villages or settlements inhabited by Europeans and their descendants and Indian pueblos, for example. It affirmed the self-government of native groups and basically codified the fact that indigenous people had certain rights under Spanish rule and that these rights involved not being interfered with by Europeans or their descendants. Now, often these laws were honored more in the breach than in practice, but these laws had an influence and still have an influence in California law. Now, in Spanish California, let's say between 1769 and 1821, most of the land was controlled by the presidios and the missions, right? Now, mission land by law, according to the laws of the Indies, was recognized as belonging to the native people in which the missions were established, among which the missions were established. The idea being that the mission was taking custody of that land on behalf of the native people, and at a certain point it would be returned to them, and they would become pueblos, right? It would become towns. And of course, the missions themselves functioned as ranchos. They were agricultural operations. There were cattle, livestock being raised, and other farming activities going on. Now, there were also non-mission ranchos that were owned by the Spanish government or owned by the king. That's why they were called Rancho del Rey or Rancho de la Nación under Mexico. And of course, presidios themselves had their own ranchos, right, where they raised cattle. Now, during the Spanish time, there were very few grants that were given to individuals. One well-known case was that of a man named Manuel Butrón, who was a soldier at Carmel. And in 1775, he married an indigenous woman, and he received the first private land grant in Alta, California. This grant, in fact, had to be approved by Junipero Serra himself, which he did. Now, as I mentioned before, missions were always meant to be temporary things. And in 18th century Spanish California, a mission was supposed to last no more than 10 years before it would be returned to the native people who lived on it, or the control of it would be returned to the native people who lived on it. Now, we know that missions lasted longer than 10 years, and in many cases, most cases, the missionaries who had responsibility for the missions believed that the Indian people on them weren't ready to take control. And there were various reasons for that. It wasn't simply racism. They also felt that they would be vulnerable to exploitation in many ways. But in any case, they were very much opposed to granting control of the mission lands back to the indigenous people in a term of 10 years. Nevertheless, under Governor Figueroa, who arrived in California in 1833, but he was told that part of his mission in Alta California was to secularize the missions, to devolve them back to the Indian people, right? In fact, there was a bill that was signed in the Mexican Congress in 1833, authored by Juan Bendini, who was a merchant who had settled in Alta California and San Diego, went back to Mexico, and an army officer named Jose Maria Padres, who later led a colonization group to Southern California, Southern Alta California, that demanded that the missions be secularized, that they be closed down, that the lands be returned to the Indians, or a portion of the land be returned to the Indians, and that the rest be offered to colonists, to settlers, right? So Figueroa knew he had to shut down the missions, but he was in favor of doing it in a gradual way. Nevertheless, his hand was forced, and in 1834, he began the process of secularization of the missions and therefore of land grants to private owners. Now, according to the rules that were promulgated in Mexico, every Native American head of family and all single men over 21, we're talking about Indian people, would receive a parcel of land between 100 and 400 square varas. Now, a vara is between 1.5 and 7 square acres, okay? So, vara is about a meter, a yard, but 100 square varas, between 100 and 400 square varas meant between 1.5 and 7 square acres. So after doing that, whatever lands were considered to be not necessary, or whatever lands were left over, were declared vacant. And that's where the large-scale land grants come in that we're talking about. As you know, over the years between 1835 and 1846, hundreds of people received land grants, the vast majority of whom were Californios, that is, Spanish-Mexican Californians who had settled or had been born in Alta California and who had shown themselves to have rendered some service to the nation. So the vast majority of the land grants were given out to those types of people. Nevertheless, it is interesting to note that a limited number of Native people also applied for and received grants from the governors of Alta California. And here we're going to talk about a few of them who are particularly known in Northern California. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is known as Rancho Ulistac, which was a large tract along the lower Guadalupe River, which runs through the San Jose area. And this was granted in 1845 to a man named Marcelo, who was a son of the former headman of Mission Santa Clara and the district of Mission Santa Clara known as San Francisco Solano. So it was given by Governor Pio Pico to Marcelo, and it was also used by two other native people, Pio and Cristobal, who belonged to the Damian clan of the Ohlone people, right? And a 19th century survey, a land survey, recorded at least 3 Indian dwellings and one sweat house on Rancho Listac, showing that Native people were still using the land for traditional practices. A sweat house, a very important location, an important structure for a lot of ceremonies among indigenous people. And it was a practice that endured throughout the mission period. The rancho eventually wound up in the hands of a man named Jacob Hoppy, an American who became the first postmaster of San Jose. And in fact, if you go today, you can visit the land where Rancho Listac was located, where this temescal or sweat lodge was located. And it's literally across the street from Levi's Stadium, where the San Francisco 49ers play. So this was a very important native rancho for a number of years. And once again, it was owned by people connected to Mission Santa Clara. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about is Rancho Los Coches, it was called. And Rancho Los Coches, which basically meant the hog ranch, belonged to a man named Roberto Bellarmino, who was also a member of the Damian people, the local branch of the Ohlone in the Santa Clara Valley. And for a period of time, Roberto was a cook at Mission Santa Clara. In 1836, he built an adobe house there on the lands of the mission. And in 1840, he actually petitioned for a grant of the land that surrounded his house. He received approximately 2,000 acres from Governor Juan Bautista Alvarado, who was governor at the time, which was confirmed 4 years later by another governor. This one was Manuel Michel Torena, who was a governor sent from Mexico. Alvarado was born here in Alta, California, and was involved in insurrections against the Mexican government. Well, Roberto eventually sold his adobe and property to a man named Antonio Suñol. And Antonio Suñol was a Spaniard who came from Spain, rather unusual, who came from Spain, directly from Spain, and settled in the San Jose area. The property later passed on to different owners, a Croatian ship's captain, and then other families. But the interesting thing about this is that Roberto's original adobe, along with the house that Antonio Suñol built, has now been restored and cared for, and it's a museum that is open to visitors. And I've gone there, taken my kids. It's a really wonderful place to enter into early California and to be able to see and touch this historic adobe that was owned by Roberto Bellarmino. Now, it's known as the Roberto Suñol Adobe Site, and it's maintained by a group called the California Pioneers of Santa Clara County, many of whom are descendants of Californios, of early California settlers, and they are dedicated to honoring the early people of the area. So I urge you to go visit the Roberto Suñol Adobe. Now, another important ranch or rancho was Rancho La Purísima Concepción, which was in the Los Altos area on the west side of the Santa Clara Valley. And in 1840, it was granted to a man named Jose Gorgonio, who had come to Mission Santa Clara with his father in 1790 when he was just a little boy. He was 2 years old. 4 years later, he sold the rancho to a woman named Juana Briones. And Juana Briones was one of the important early settlers of Yerba Buena, which became San Francisco. I also have a podcast recording about her. You should look it up. And she bought the rancho from him in 1844. And that rancho took in what is today Sunnyvale, the cities of Sunnyvale and Los Altos, right? And Juana Briones was, in fact, an early Afro-Latina pioneer of the peninsula. So it also has a very interesting history. Now, one more rancho that I want to talk about is Rancho Pozolomi, which was owned by a man named Lope Íñigo. And Lope Íñigo was born in 1781, and he died in 1864. He also was an Ohlone Indian who grew up in the region of Mission Santa Clara. He petitioned for a grant in 1839, in November of 1839, and received it on January 20th, 1840, from Governor Alvarado. And of course, we have the text of the grant. And in fact, Randall Milliken, very famous anthropologist, wrote a whole book about Lope Íñigo and his ranch. And according to the grant, he was also granted 10 tame breeding cows, 5 bulls, 15 mares and a stallion, 2 yoke of oxen, 5 milk cows, 4 tame horses, 50 sheep, 10 mules, 1 cart, 1 plow. And he also had with him his son Manuel and his grandson Casimir. On July 8th of 1841, Lope Íñigo again petitioned, stating that his promised property had not been received. But on July 26th of the same year, he registered a brand, right? A cattle brand. Very important. So it seems that he must have finally received it, right? That's just a couple of weeks later. He seems to have had troubles with the mission administrator, the civilian administrator, Ignacio Albizu. But his grant was confirmed again by Governor Michel Turena, the Mexican governor sent to Alta California. It was confirmed in 1844. And it was approximately 3,000 acres of land, which today this land encompasses what is Moffett Field. Moffett Field, which is huge airfield, NASA facility. The Air National Guard goes out of there. Google flies out. It's a huge, now it's a real tech hub. But that was at one time Rancho Pozolomi of Lope Íñigo. Now, like many people, he had trouble with squatters in the 1850s and wound up losing quite a bit of his land, but he did retain a few hundred acres, as was the case with many, not just indigenous people, but Californios too, that they had people come set up shop on their land, and then they had to defend it in court and lost most of it. So Lope Íñigo died in 1864 with very little of his land left. And once again, if you travel to Moffett Field in the north end of the Santa Clara or the peninsula, you can see what today is, or you can see today what was Lope Íñigo's rancho. Now, the final ranch owner I'm going to talk about is a man named Camilo Initia. Camilo Initia was born in 1816, and he was the last headman of the Coast Miwok village of Olumpali. And Olumpali is located in Marin County, north of San Francisco. Now, this village was continually occupied for at least 600 years, right? Archaeological excavations over the years have revealed that Olumpali was one of the most important of all the Coast Miwok villages and a center of economic and social activity. Now, there are records that the Spanish first encountered this village in 1776. And between 1814 and 1822, more than 250 people from Olompali were baptized in missions around the San Francisco Bay Area, most of whom were baptized at Mission San Jose, which is today in Fremont, and Mission Dolores, which is in the city of San Francisco. Now, Olompali seems to have also served as a mission rancheria, as an outpost of Christian Indians, not within the close boundaries of the mission, but on the outskirts. So this would have been the mission at first Mission San Rafael, and then later Mission San Francisco Solano. Now, in 1823, we know regular trade was conducted with the Sonoma Mission and Pueblo, and El Camino Real, which was the transportation route that passed through Olompali. In fact, in 1828, Father Juan Amoros wrote, "From the Mission San Rafael toward the north is the Rancheria of Olompali, or Santissimo Rosario, the Holy Rosary, where there is a little house. Their captain, that is their leader, is a Christian and raises food with the help of the mission." Now, Camilo was only 12 at the time, too young to be the captain, quote unquote, that Father Amoros referred to. But by 1841, he was in charge of the village or rancheria of Olompali. William Hartnell, an Englishman who came to Alta California, married into an important family, and was sent around to inspect the various missions after secularization, stated that Initia had, quote, peacefully occupied Olompali since 1834, unquote. That's the year that General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo secularized Mission San Francisco Solano. Vallejo claimed that Camilo had been in possession of Olompali for 6 years, since 1837, and that he had built a house there and planted an orchard and vineyard, and, quote, has the place stocked with cattle and horses. Now, Camilo Initia maintained a lasting and extremely friendly relationship with Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo, but he did not participate in military actions against other tribes, in contrast to his friend Francisco Solano, whom I spoke about in another podcast episode, which you should go back and listen to if you haven't. Francisco Solano was a chieftain of the Patwin Suisun people, and he was a very important military ally of General Vallejo and helped him subdue a number of native people in the north coast of Alta California. Camilo asked for an 8,000-acre grant of the territory around Olompali. And in 1843, General Vallejo personally conveyed Camilo's petition to the territorial government at Monterey and filed it on Camilo's behalf. That was approved, right? And it was known over time to be a thriving rancho. William Heath Davis, who traveled all over California, had this to say. He said, quote, "I knew this chief, who was a fine, intelligent, and shrewd man. He was likewise a wheat raiser and sold his crops to the Russians," unquote. So the Russians, as you may know, had settled north of the San Francisco Bay in an area around what is known today as Bodega Bay, northern Sonoma County, and they had constructed a colony, a fort known as Fort Ross or Colony Ross, up there beginning in 1812. So Camilo was engaged in trade with them, selling crops, selling wheat to the Russians. Now, according to what people have said, he lived in an adobe he had constructed himself, ran 5,000 to 6,000 head of cattle, planted an extensive orchard and vineyard, and raised wheat, as I mentioned. His adobe was a popular stopping place for Californios, for Europeans and Americans who traveled the main trade route between San Francisco and Sonoma. Now, during the Bear Flag Revolt of 1846, when a group of Americans took over the central plaza of Sonoma and took General Vallejo prisoner and basically declared Alta California an independent republic, a group of Yankees surprised Captain Joaquin de la Torre and Juan Padilla, who were Californios who were fighting against them. They surprised these men and their troops while they were enjoying breakfast at Camilo's adobe. So Camilo Anitia's adobe played an important role also in the Bear Flag Revolt and during this crucial time of California history. Now, just like every other rancho owner, pre-American rancho owner in California, Camilo had to deal with the U.S. Land Commission. In 1852, he filed his case arguing for his ownership of Rancho Olompali. On August 30th of that year, perhaps concerned with the outcome of the case, he sold the major part of it to a man named James Black, who was the Marin County assessor, and he sold it for $5,200 in gold coin. Now, his patent was confirmed by the Land Commission on December 18th of 1852, which is pretty quick. Sometimes those cases dragged out for years and even as much as a decade or more. He, Camilo, retained the southeast portion of Rancho Olompali. And then later, on February 14th of 1853, St. Valentine's Day, I don't know if that had anything to do with anything, he conveyed approximately 20 acres to a man named John Pinkston, who was the husband of Camilo's adopted daughter and known as, quote, a free man of color. So he was an African descendant who was a free man living in California in 1853. Pinkston was given the land in trust for Camilo's grandson, Juan Jose Pinkston. So remember, Camilo's adopted daughter married Pinkston, and their son was to inherit the land. He had been born several years earlier, so he was probably a few years old. Now, Camilo died only 2 years later, in 1856. Did I say 2 years? No. 3 years later, in 1856. On November 26th of 1860, being, quote, in want of money for maintenance, Maxima and Maria, two of Camilo's daughters, sold Apalacocha, a part of their land, which they stated contained, quote, about 500 acres of nearly all mountain land, to a man named John Knight, who was their attorney, for $3,693. So, years later, this land wound up being operated. It changed hands a number of times. It's on a beautiful portion of Marin County near the town of Novato. And years later, the land was operated in different capacities. It was a retreat center, a religious retreat center for seminarians, Catholic seminarians. It was a swim club. And most famously, it was a hippie commune. And the Grateful Dead lived there in the 1960s. And in 1977, it became a state historic park. It still is a state historic park that you can visit today. So, Camilo Initia, Rancho Olompali, is one of the most important native villages that later became a rancho on the north coast of Alta California. So, to wrap up, mission lands were understood, according to Spanish law, as belonging to the native people who inhabited them. However, few native people were able to obtain enough land to benefit from secularization. That is, the shutting down of the missions and the conversion of their land to lands for private owners. Now, some California indigenous people with strong ties or respected positions within the missions were able to obtain grants for ranchos, similar to those obtained by their Spanish/Mexican counterparts. A much smaller number, but nevertheless, some did. But it was those who maintained good relationships with the important figures in Mexican California society, Californio society, who were able to have some degree of success. Someone, for example, like a man named Camilo Enitia. Nevertheless, with the annexation of Alta California by the U.S., and the massive waves of immigrants coming from the east into Alta California, settling on these lands, it was really almost impossible to be able to maintain the land and to be able to come out with their property integral after the long drawn-out court battles that they needed to fight in order to keep the land. So, the native people with ranchos pretty much suffered the same fate as the Californios when it came to the U.S. courts and the U.S. lawyers, and so very little of that property remained with them. Finally, some of these places we can still visit today to get an idea of the type of dwellings, the type of life that was lived there, and I strongly urge you to do so. So I hope that this has been helpful and of interest to you. And if you know of any native ranchos in your area or you've read about them, please let me know. I'd love to investigate. I'd love to learn more. And I'd love to also feature them on this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.